Hello, welcome to another episode of the Brighter Thinking Pod from Cambridge University Press. I'm your host, Janey Webb. Today, we're here to discuss 21st century skills, with a focus on Cambridge global perspectives. I've done a lot of research and spoken to teachers around the world on this topic as the commissioning editor for our Global Perspectives resources, so I'm really looking forward to digging into this further with our two guests today. This time, we have two new voices to welcome into the podcast mix. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Adrian Ravenscroft to the show. Adrian is an independent education consultant and is also working on our new Global Perspectives primary series. Adrian, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, thank you.
Our second guest is Tom Holman, who is an assessment specialist and is co-writing our primary series with Adrian. Tom, it's great to have you here today.
It's very nice to be here, thank you.
Both Adrian and Tom will be answering questions on the topic of 21st century skills and global perspectives. So before we get started, remember, all the links and information we discuss are available in the show notes. You can also get in touch with us on Twitter using the hashtag BrighterPod or by tweeting us at CUP Education. Before we discuss skills development, I thought it might be nice to get to know our guests a little more. I have a question that we've asked Tom and Adrian to have a think about, which is, what is the best lesson you've ever had? This could be one you've taught yourself or one where you were the student. But we want to know what made it stand out to you. Adrian, what's your best ever lesson and why?
One lesson I'd like to share with you from my own experience was I was working at a school with a group of children who had been identified as not reaching the potential that their prior assessment had said that they would be capable of doing. And we needed to turn things around and pretty quickly in the end of key stage assessment year. And I knew that the deputy head teacher was due to come in and see my lesson at some point. And on the day of the lesson, she turned up with a clipboard, and I was initially profusely apologetic. I said, "Look, I'm ever so sorry. Today they're just going to be writing." And I said, "No, it's no problem, Adrian. I'll see the lesson that you've got planned." And so, I'll let it roll. And the deputy head teacher saw these children, 10, 11-year-olds, doing what I described as just writing. And it's subsequently become clearer to me why actually that lesson was successful, without perhaps me realising quite the extent to which it was at the time. What had I done? I think I had successfully, in previous lessons, they knew how to plan, monitor, and evaluate their own learning. I'd modelled my own thinking to help them know what I thought a good job looked like. I'd set them an appropriate level of challenge. I knew where they were headed. They knew where they were headed. They knew, I'd use various phrases. If you want to knock my socks off, you can have a go at doing this. Okay, go on then. We're going to give that a go. Previous lessons, whereas this one was really very much like, right, we're getting our heads down and doing our writing. Previous lessons had been characterised, what I now understand to be metacognitive talk, talking about our own learning, pupils talking together about it. Okay, what's this like? How could we do even better? And I'd explicitly taught them how they could organise their own learning independently. And for all those reasons, I think it worked.
Fantastic. So real independence, ownership of learning, engagement with the task, scaffolded towards being able to demonstrate those skills. That sounds fantastic. And Tom, how about you?
Well, I must say I came at this rather differently. It was an interesting question to ask, definitely, because what becomes apparent is all those thousands of hours that you've spent in the classroom. In my case, as a primary teacher, in my local primary school, it's the times when you actually manage to get out of the classroom that really stick in your mind. And one of the first things that came to mind was a lesson when we were looking at the water cycle. I think it must have been geography or science. And it was a lovely sunny day, and we just walked out of the classroom onto the playground carrying buckets of water and simulated a kind of rain shower on the playground to see where the water went. And obviously some of it evaporated and some of it ran down into the storm drains and so on. But it is that kind of exception to being in the classroom that really does stick in the mind and makes you think that actually that kind of learning is likely to be so much more memorable to the children involved. I mean, I also then had another related memory of probably only a few days after that, getting really quite annoyed in the classroom because there was a lot of noise coming from the street outside. And then looking out the window and realizing that this was a group of workers from the local water company digging a hole in the street outside. And again, I just took the whole class out, and these men were astonished to see, a group of 30, 10, 11-year-olds standing around the hole that they had just dug, looking at a water main, which was probably the first time they'd ever seen anything like it, bringing the water into the school. So it's that kind of thing that sticks in the mind more and makes me think that's when perhaps most learning happens for children. And it's one of the things that I think makes Global Perspectives particularly attractive, is that it offers opportunities for that kind of learning.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Memorable learning experience and the flexibility to adapt to the circumstance. Thank you both. Both very different approaches, but interesting answers, and sound like good fun lessons too. So I'm moving on now to our first question. So this is to set the tone of the show, and it digs into 21st century skills a little more. Really, what we wanted to ask was, what to you does the term 21st century skills actually mean? Tom, would you mind starting for us?
Okay, I felt I'd drawn the short straw a little bit when I heard this. Yes, it's a very grand sounding term. And I think the first thing that I'd say is these are not skills which are exclusive to the 21st century by any means. I think we've needed such skills going back for a long, long time. But currently, I think there is more demand for such skills, and more people need to have access to them. And if you look at the Global Perspectives curriculum, there's a list of the skills: research, analysis, evaluation, reflection, collaboration, communication. And it's a rather dry sounding list. And if you wanted to know more about that, the best place probably to look is in the Cambridge Global Perspectives curriculum framework, where you can see the learning objectives related to each of those skills strands. But I think it's the effect of learning those skills which is most important in some ways, and also to regard them as a kind of package rather than just each skill in isolation. These skills are kind of mutually supportive of one another. And I don't want to tread on the toes of the next question, but they are skills which are going to help our learners to adapt to a changing world and succeed in work environments and cope with life in general, I think.
Sure, thank you. And Adrian, is there anything you would like to add to that?
I think I very much like the way that this question was phrased initially, as in, what does the phrase 21st century skills mean to you? And that, I think, is something that our listeners would do well to ponder on as well, because, of course, the impact of the changes that are shaping our world are being felt very differently in different places. I think that's an absolutely crucial thing to get your head around. Okay, so let's take it. What does it mean for me as being somebody from a former industrial area, the West Midlands of England? What does it mean, 20th century skills? I think it's an appropriate time, 2 decades in, to take stock of like where have we come from? Where are we headed? I think if we go back 50 years, where I come from, I think the pace of change certainly was increasing. The majority of pupils did not pass the 11 plus that would allow them to go to grammar school. They went to secondary modern schools. And whilst the pace of change was increasing, I think that the perception of the schools was that secondary modern schools had an understanding of the world of work in which these young people were going to pass their working lives. And therefore, the model that they had was that there are certain skills, knowledge, understanding that could be transmitted. Young people would hit the workplace with qualifications in skills, for example, like technical drawing, that were deemed to be relevant to the world of work. From that, employers would then invest quite highly in the skills of people they took on through apprenticeships. And one could go from being an unskilled worker to a skilled worker and get a decent job and decent job security on the back of maybe 4 or 5 year long apprenticeships. But I think what happened is, of course, the pace of change ramped up. And so that in a very, very short space of time, if a machine was developed that could do that industrial process that took you 4 or 5 years to learn how to do it as a skilled craftsperson, all of a sudden you find yourself being a highly skilled craftsperson to being essentially a machine minder. If the change was fast in the 1970s, well, it has increased exponentially since then. The understanding of the world of work that our young learners are going to go on to, how they are going to spend their working lives, I think if we're really honest with ourselves, is that we have very little understanding beyond the fact that they are going to continue to have to cope with exponentially increasing change. So from a situation where the skills development might be characterized by transmission, I think what we need to characterize our skills development of our learners is transformative. So you need to have the knowledge, the skills, the attributes of a lifelong learner in order to continue, frankly, to make a living.
Thank you very much for that, Adrian. A very interesting and in-depth response to the question. It sounds like it's all about preparing learners to be able to cope with their future and that adaptability to manage in response to whatever the world is throwing at us, and the individual skills contribute together and collect together to enable those competencies to sort of build within the individual and move forward. So moving on really to question 2, which is a direct follow-on from that. After we've discussed what we mean by 21st century skills, we'd like to now look at why they're important and why is it particularly beneficial for schools to think about them. I think you've already touched on this, but maybe if, Tom, I could just ask you to give your thoughts around the perspective from schools in thinking about teaching students around 21st century skills.
Right, okay. I think, first of all, what I'd say is that from a school's point of view, one of the benefits of the global perspective's focus on skills is that these skills will be transferable. They'll be useful to the learners across the curriculum. It won't just be that they are skills for global perspectives. They'll be useful in science, in humanities, in social sciences, and so on. That's one thing. I mean, the other thing is to really think well, what happens if schools ignore these skills? Learners are likely to be facing situations in their lives outside school where they are needing skills of this sort anyway. And it would be, well, I hesitate to say irresponsible, but it would be not perhaps facing up to your full responsibilities as educationalists to help children, young learners, to become as effective and efficient in their use of those skills as possible, rather than having to find all of this out for themselves. For instance, when they do a search online for information, how do they cope with the huge amount of information that's available on the internet? How do they know what is reliable information, what is credible, and so on? When they're using social media to interact with their peers, how can they make those interactions more constructive and creative rather than destructive? I think there are questions like this that schools need to face up to, that, these things will be going on whether or not they really address the issue of the types of skills we've been talking about. So it would be really, I feel, incumbent on schools to take some responsibility for the development of those skills, to make sure that they happen in the right way, let's say.
Thank you very much. And Adrian, did you have any thoughts to add?
So we spoke previously about the world of the 21st century being characterized by increasingly rapid change. And so far what we're witnessing certainly is that this rapid change is accompanied by corresponding increased pressure on the world's resources. So why do we need to prepare our learners with 21st century skills? Well, why not let's make our schools the kind of models of the kind of sustainable and democratic communities that are going to be the kind of places that are going to formulate solutions to the problems caused by increasing pressure on the world's resources. Tom was talking there about efficient and effective models of learning, and as they might apply to finding out facts. I think that could equally apply. How can we efficiently, fairly, effectively use the resources that are at our disposal? So, our schools should be models for that. And by doing that, I would suggest they become better places to teach in and better places to learn in.
Thank you for that. Interesting. Taking that into more detail, how would you suggest that we teach 21st century skills to young children, so children perhaps of primary age? Do you think that's possible?
I think it's not only possible, but it's essential that we do so. I think that, the way that global perspectives has evolved initially, we were looking at high stakes qualification for secondary age pupils. And then gradually, as time went on, people asked themselves the question, well, how can we better prepare our learners for these, in the final analysis, high stakes qualifications at the end of their education process? We could equally flip that and look at that, in fact, much good quality early years, foundation stage, kindergarten, depending on what your terminology is where you are, but good practice with young children has always fostered the kind of self-regulated learning, collaboration, communication, reflection. Let's have a look. Oh, what are you making there? It's interesting. Okay, let's look at so-and-so. Are they making, what have they done differently? What they've done, what can we learn from that? What do you like about what you've done there? Those kind of high-quality dialogue that you see that goes on with a really good quality early years specialist engaging with learners, actually, yes, the cognitive demands at the level of skills that we expect of our older learners, it goes without saying that the cognitive demands are higher. But I would say that the attributes of the successful learner are entirely applicable. Responsibility, being engaged, being empathetic to our colleagues, reflecting on our learning, evaluating our progress. Those apply right across the board.
Thank you for that. And Tom, was there anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, yes, I suppose one thing that came to my mind when I heard the question was, how do we teach that? But also flip that, how do learners learn those skills? And as I was saying in an earlier answer, this is going to happen outside school, whether or not we want it. It's going to be part of growing up in the modern world, if you like. And the question then is, can we in schools actually provide learners with that type of experience, that type of encounter with the real world, if you like, which is likely to help them to bring those skills on, to develop those skills? So I think, it's a question of trying to match those two things in a way, what schools can do in terms of scaffolding the experiences that learners are already aware perhaps that they are in need of, that, it's something that they have found that it would be useful to have in their interactions with the real world anyway. So there's the motivation there for learning, I believe. If schools can find a way of helping to scaffold it. And I think, Global Perspectives does provide them with some of that scaffolding. I think, what we see, particularly with the curriculum for the earlier stages, is that there's a lot of emphasis on teachers providing the kind of material that the learners might work with. And that provision is gradually removed as the learners get older and go into later stages and so on. There's also, I think it's worth pointing out, in Global Perspectives, there's this emphasis on different levels of perspective, if you like, between a personal perspective, a local or national perspective, and a global perspective. And again, the emphasis for younger learners will be much more on their personal perspective. What do I think or feel about this? And perhaps then beginning to wonder, well, why do I think or feel this way about this issue? Moving on then to, how do other people think or feel about it, and why? And you can see there a kind of progression from the personal towards the more local or national, and ultimately, of course, towards the global. And I think the other thing that we could point to here in terms of a progression for younger learners is that distinction between primary and secondary research, for instance. This is something that we've tried to look at in the work that we've been doing, how we can engage younger learners in primary research, where they go out and ask questions, interview people, use questionnaires and so on, acquire the data for themselves, rather than having to access what are sometimes really quite dense technical texts, which provide secondary sources of research. So again, there's that progression perhaps from more emphasis on primary research for younger learners, moving through to the emphasis on secondary research as they get older.
Thank you for that. It's interesting hearing about that progression with how you would approach your teaching as the children get older, from moving from primary to secondary. So thank you for your answers to that. Moving on to the next question, we're looking a bit more about the practical reality of the classroom in this question. So question 3 really focuses on how to structure a skills lesson. Ahead of the show, we asked you both to bring a lesson plan that teachers could take away with them and use today. Tom, could you tell me which skill you've chosen to focus on, and then tell us about your lesson plan?
Yes, okay. I think the main focus would be on collaboration and communication, which I think are interesting areas that Global Perspectives perhaps brings more to the fore than some other curriculum subjects might do.
Mm-hmm.
What interests me here is how you can, again, bring in other skills to support this process of collaboration and communication. So I'm going to talk about something which I'm afraid might be rather old hat to some of our listeners, but it's using what I think now is referred to as a jigsaw style activity in the classroom as a way of distributing information among the learners so that they can then collaborate to piece together that information. So if I talk in very general terms, you'd need, as a teacher, to have a source available which contains information of the sort that you want the learners to share with each other. I'm going to use an example that is in the book that we've written, which is to do with bees, for instance. So as with any, we'll think of this in terms of using a reading text as a source. And as with any reading activity, you would need some purpose to that. So you'd perhaps ask some questions that you want the learners to find out about from this source, or you'd have encouraged the learners to perhaps write their own questions. What are they particularly interested in finding out? But the key thing will be to not to give each learner the source in its entirety. So if we're thinking in terms of a reading text, and we're thinking now in terms of working as groups, collaborating in groups, or maybe think of 4 learners in a group, split the text, the source, into 4 parts. This could be done quite simply by cutting it up, if you like, photocopying it, cutting it up, and then making sure that within each group, each learner gets a different part of the text with different information in it. The learners then spend a little time working on their own individually with the questions that either they have set or you as the teacher have set in mind, looking for information to respond to those questions, possibly taking notes of that. They then get back into a group and begin to share or pool that information with each other, each of them having had something rather different to look at. So you can see there how important communication will be in the activity. They will have to be able to convey the information that they found out from their bit of the text or source. They will also, of course, have to listen to one another in order to get that information from each other. But I think it also works well in terms of collaboration. And it's not just because they're working as a group. I think collaboration can be seen as something more involved than that. I think, for instance, it would be an opportunity to get the groups to do an assigning of roles within the group, or to actually assign those roles yourself as teacher. But we would be thinking perhaps in terms of having one member of the group being a secretary who's going to write down all the information, another member of the group who might be a kind of coordinator who would make sure that everyone got an equal chance to speak and to communicate their information. Someone else might be acting as a timekeeper to make sure that all of this was done within the time set by the teacher. Someone else might actually be a kind of reporter in the group, someone who is actually going to tell other groups what that particular group has found out about bees in this case. I think then also there is one other skill that could be drawn in here. I mean, you can see also the links to research here, for instance, but reflection is also a very interesting area in Global Perspectives. And it perhaps means something slightly different in a Global Perspectives context than one might imagine. And again, looking at the curriculum framework would be the best way to see exactly what it means. But it's very often to do with asking learners to reflect on their individual contribution to teamwork. So they've worked as a team, they've collaborated to share this information. How well did they think they did that, and what could they improve about their performance on that aspect of the task? It's also, reflection skill is also focused on getting learners to think, well, what have I personally learnt from this, which has perhaps altered my thinking about a topic or an issue? Or what might actually lead to changes in my behavior as a result of what I've learned. So I think, a jigsaw activity of this type brings in a lot of different skills. It does need a bit of structuring, of course, by the teacher. This is something which needs to be prepared beforehand. But I think there are such benefits to be gained from it that is a worthwhile investment, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. That was absolutely fascinating. And I love the way you broke down what collaboration might involve in terms of the practical reality of it, and similarly with reflection. Really interesting.
Yeah. They are quite complex skills.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to hear you articulate the nuance of them in that way and in the context of the classroom as well. How about you, Adrian? Could you tell us which skill you decided to focus on and which ideas you've brought in terms of a lesson?
Yeah, I picked out a lesson on analysing perspectives. Essentially, this lesson looks at two things. How can we identify different perspectives? How can I spot something that is for or against a proposition, or something that adopts a neutral stance? Having done so, how can I gauge the strength of feeling either for or against this proposition based on the language that's used? I think for effective global perspectives teaching, you need to be aware through engagement with the local community, the local media, what's happening in your area. What are people getting hot under the collar about? In my particular locality, it's the construction of a new supermarket. Wherever you are, your place will be changing. Are learners already having some sort of exposure to a local issue? How do they feel about it? Are they clear on three things? Firstly, am I clear what I think about what the issue is? Am I clear why it's contested? Am I clear why the people who support it, and why some of them feel strongly about it? Why the converse is true? Having established how people feel, and it's worth establishing this climate, isn't it? That if I do not feel clear about it, it is okay to do so. Okay, having established that, why I'm clear, why I'm less clear, what would help to improve our score? Let's open that discussion. Different perspectives, talk to different people, look at the local media. Okay, having done so that, let's move then to a different issue. It could be one that's taking place at a different scale. The one that we look at in the learning materials is the construction of a dam. We need to give our learners some perspectives. Within the learning materials in the teacher's guide, some are provided for you. I think really, you need to be looking about the media, and yes, we need to be adapting them appropriately for our young learners. Let's look at phrases in. People are just making money out of other people's misery. Well, there's one that we could identify. Is that for or against everybody? That sounds pretty much against. Okay, how do we know that that's against? Do you think that sounds okay? Making money out of other people's... Yeah, we don't like misery, do we? No. Okay, right. So having established, right, this is something that is against the proposition, in this case that the dam is being built. Well, do we think that's somewhat against or strongly against? Let's have a look at it again. The working conditions on this dam project are a total disgrace. These merciless contractors are just making money out of other people's misery. Okay. I think what we're getting here is something that's pretty strongly against that dam, isn't it? Right. Okay, so moving on. We now understand how to spot an argument, whether it's for, against, strongly for, strongly against. Having understood that, what are we going to do with that? Well, we're going to apply that to our context, Okay. Divide your class up. They might have their own prior perspective on that. You may choose to let them do so. Yeah. If they've decided, actually, I quite like the idea of this new supermarket. I'm opposed to this new supermarket. That's one way of doing it. Or another possibility, simply allocate them. Give them a local person that they've come across to role play their response to this new supermarket construction, right? Okay. Now you know what a response strongly for, strongly against might sound like to this different project. Have them role play that to a partner. Okay. And then the partner can give them feedback. Okay, how well have you done? Did you manage to convince me? Recap. How are we now? How do we feel? Do you think we have now got better at spotting some different ways that people might think about an issue? These are skills that are going to stay with them right the way through the development of global perspective.
Thank you for that, Adrian. So it's about really highlighting real issues, modelling example perspectives within that, using real language, real examples, getting the students to put things into practice, working with their peers, and encouraging them to reflect on what they've been doing as well. Thank you very much, both of you, for those responses. And that brings us to the end of this. Thank you very much to Adrian Ravenscroft and Thomas Holman for being here with us today and taking time.
You're welcome.
No, thank you very much. And taking time out of your very busy schedules. Thank you also to anyone who sent in questions. We'd love to hear from you. So please do keep them coming. Adrian and Tom, where can people find out more about you?
Okay, you can look me up on LinkedIn, where I periodically share articles that I think people might find useful on pedagogy.
Thank you, Adrian. And Tom?
Oh, well, yes, I'm a bit hard to get in this respect. I'll just repeat that I think it's important to get in touch with Cambridge International and see what training opportunities they provide. If there's anything more personal, if you send it to Adrian, I'm sure he'll pass it on to me.
Thank you for that. And that's all for our 21st Century Skills episode. Don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues about us and rate our show on whatever platform you're listening on. Our show notes have lots of useful links that we've discussed throughout the episode, so be sure to check them out and remember to follow us at CUP Education or use the hashtag BrighterPod to get in touch. You can also email us at educationmarketing@cambridge.org. We'll see you next time.